But the project is entitled Reclaiming Lost Ground, and is focused really around urban areas and trying to understand how we've transcended into a situation where large sums of central land, high utility land, has been allocated for parking purposes. It's not an issue for just Australia, it's an issue internationally. And interestingly, when you look at the data, it's a question of immobility that we really need to be focusing on, not mobility. If you look at a lot of the transport research, they're predominantly concerned with things that move. Whereas that's important, we can test that, sure, but for a lot of the time, vehicles spend 95% of their time stationary or immobile. And so that's the core, the thrust of this particular project, is getting a lot of information for Brisbane, for Sydney and for Melbourne. Firstly, to try and understand how much land is allocated in our city spaces for parking purposes. For Brisbane itself, we've got something around 25,500 spaces in the CBD for parking. Sydney is just under 29,000, and Melbourne comes in at just over 41,500 spaces that are allocated purely for parking. That's just in those central areas. Many of these spaces are actually worth more than the cars themselves that park in there. Recent evidence there's a recent sale of a car space in Sydney. This is just the middle of last year. $120,000, one single car space went in central Sydney. So the project is centred around this idea, firstly, of enumerating how much space is allocated just for parking, and trying to understand the consequences of three really very interesting emerging trends. And these trends are one of the social trends. So new social trends are suggesting for the first time we've had a reduction in the number of vehicle kilometres travelled. Also, for the first time, the love affair with the car in Australia seems to have turned a corner. Young people are putting off, even postponing, maybe even never getting a driving licence. Other rings are the emergence of vehicle sharing devices, so we're all familiar with Uber and Lyft. All of these things come together to effectively reduce the demand for cars, and so we've seen a reduction in the demand over time. That of land use, we're probably more familiar with the sort of land use planning that's gone on within West End. Things like the central policies within all Australian cities is one towards urban infill, consolidation and development to higher densities, densification. You don't have to look too many fast streets away from here to see the effect. I've been here in Australia for 13 years now, and over the last 13 years there's been massive shifts in the way in which West End has looked over that 13-year period. Things like transit-oriented development, so that's densification around particular key transit nodes like train stations and around transit corridors. All of these key land use changes have also reduced the demand for cars and car spaces. And the final one has been around technology, and technology in the form of autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles. We've probably seen some of this in the media, the way in which these new technologies are starting to take shape, less so in Australia, more so elsewhere around the world. But it's these technologies that are likely to have a massive impact in the way in which we need and use parking. So, for example, what we'll see is the likelihood, there's one school of thought, in fact, that these new vehicle sharing companies will be largely run and operated by mobility services. That's associated with essentially some of the liabilities and the legal issues for personally owned autonomous vehicles. If that is the case, then what's likely to happen is that effectively, if individuals don't own cars, the mobility services are operating these semi-autonomous and autonomous vehicles. These vehicles are going to be in motion most of the time, therefore reducing demand for parking. I should have also mentioned in terms of the ride-sharing schemes, there's some research that points to the fact that for every single ride-sharing vehicle that's on the road, it reduces the number of privately owned vehicles from between 9 and 13, again reducing that demand for parking. So what does this all mean, and where are we kind of heading with this project? Well, this is, if those people can see from the back, a rather curious architectural solution. So this particular thing is called a taku. It's a Finnish name for it, called the stick. And it's a three-tiered structure that suggests that on a plot that's 5 meters by 2.5 meters, you can build enough living space for more than a single person to live. And these have appeared in a number of city spaces just to prove that we don't actually need that much space to live in. So what we're trying to do across this project is to try and understand the way in which those three things, so it's the way in which the social trends, the technology, and the land use planning are bringing about shifts in the location, the amount and the price of parking. And then from that, how the amount, the price and the location of the parking is shifting the way in which we move around space, our travel behaviour. What we hope to get at the end of this project, which is 3 years and it's supported by the Australian Research Council, is to be able to come out with a set of policy recommendations as it relates to parking and the way in which we can find solutions at the local level. And a key part of this is engaging with local communities, and this needs to be fed from grassroots to understand the lived reality of parking. All of you have a relationship with parking, and that lived reality plays out over the course of a day, over the course of a week. And if modifications in those environments in which you exist need to be made, we need to understand how you individually and collectively use that space such that solutions can be designed in a manner that best fits those local communities. So I'd encourage you to participate again in the Q&A session, and then afterwards we've got this breakout sessions where we're trying to sort of have a think about solutions within the West End precinct.
Thank you, Jonathan.